History is black and white. We are taught that there are good guys and bad guys. The Allies wore olive drab, the Axis wore field grey. One side fought for freedom, the other for tyranny. And when they met on the battlefield, they killed each other. That is the rule of war. It is simple. It is absolute. But on May 5, 1945, 5 days after Adolf Hitler put a bullet in his own head, history stopped making sense. Deep in the Austrian Alps, in a fairy tale castle perched on a jagged hilltop, the laws of warfare were rewritten. American GIs, chewing gum and clutching M1 Garands, found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder with soldiers of the Wehrmacht. They were sharing cigarettes. They were loading each other's magazines. They were looking out at the tree line, waiting for a common enemy that wanted them all dead. This is not an alternate history novel. This is not a Hollywood script gone off the rails. This is the story of the battle for Castle Itter, the strangest, most impossible battle of World War II. And it starts not with a bang, but with a terrifying silence. To understand why this happened, you have to understand the chaos of May 1945. The Third Reich was collapsing. It was not a surrender, it was a disintegration. The roads of Austria were clogged with a flood of humanity. Refugees fleeing west, soldiers deserting east, convoys of trucks burning by the roadside. The air smelled of pine needles, unwashed bodies, and defeat. For the average American soldier, the war was effectively over. They were just waiting for the ink to dry on the surrender papers. They were dreaming of baseball, cold beer, and girls back in Brooklyn or Ohio. The last thing any GI wanted to do was die in the last week of a 6-year war. There is a special kind of tragedy in being the last man killed. It is a statistic nobody wants to be. But in the Tyrol region of Austria, the war was not over. It was mutating. While the regular German army, the Wehrmacht, was surrendering in droves, shattering their rifles and walking home, the die-hard fanatics were not. The Waffen-SS, the regime's most loyal executioners, were roaming the countryside like wounded wolves. They had orders: death to traitors. Anyone waving a white flag was shot. Any village that surrendered without a fight was burned. They were looking for a final stand, a Gotterdämmerung, a twilight of the gods. And they had their eyes on a specific prize. Castle Itter. Schloss Itter. It sounds romantic, does not it? A 13th century fortress with thick stone walls, towering over the Brixental Valley. But for the last 2 years, it had not been a castle. It had been a prison. A VIP prison. A golden cage for the most high-value hostages the Reich possessed. Inside those stone walls sat the ghosts of the French Republic. There was Edouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, 2 former prime ministers of France. There was General Maxime Weygand and General Maurice Gamelin, the men who had led the French armies in 1940. There was Jean Barotra, a world-famous tennis star known as the Bouncing Basque. There was even the sister of General Charles de Gaulle. These were not just prisoners, they were bargaining chips. The SS believed that these high-profile hostages could be used to negotiate a separate peace, or perhaps, safe passage to South America. But now, with Berlin fallen and the leadership dead, the prisoners of Itter realized a terrifying truth. They were no longer valuable assets. They were loose ends. And the SS had a very specific way of dealing with loose ends. The mood inside the castle on May 2nd was suffocating. The prisoners could hear the distant rumble of American artillery. They could see the smoke rising from villages in the valley. The prison commander, Sebastian Wimmer, a man described by the prisoners as a brutal thug with the courage of a rat, was getting nervous. He knew the Americans were close. He also knew that the roaming bands of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division were in the woods nearby. If the SS arrived first, everyone in the castle would be executed. If the Americans arrived first, they would be saved. It was a race against time, and the prisoners were locked in the starting gate. Then, something extraordinary happened. On May 4th, Commander Wimmer fled. He stripped off his uniform, grabbed a bicycle, and pedaled away, leaving the gate wide open. The guards followed him. Suddenly, the French VIPs were masters of their own castle. But they were masters of a trap. They raided the army. The former prime ministers of France, old men in suits, were now holding MP-40 submachine guns and Mauser rifles. The Tennistar, Barotra, was checking the perimeter. But they were trapped. The woods below were crawling with the enemy. They needed help, and they needed it now. They sent out a messenger. Zvonimir Kukovic, a Yugoslav handyman who had worked at the prison. He slipped out on a bicycle, pedaling furiously toward the American lines. He did not know if he would be shot by the SS or the Americans. He just pedaled. This is where fate steps in. Normally, a request for help would go up the chain of command. It would be analyzed, debated, and filed. But in the chaos of 1945, the chain of command was broken. Decisions were made by men on the ground. Men like Captain Jack Lee. John Jack Lee was the quintessential American tanker. A cigar-chomping, rough-talking officer from the 12th Armored Division. He was tired. His tank, a customized M4 Sherman named Besotten Jenny, was covered in mud and battle scars. He and his men were parked in the town of Kufstein, waiting for the order to stand down. When the message about the castle reached him, Lee did not call the Pentagon. He did not ask for a risk assessment. He looked at his map. He looked at his men. And he made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed in any other war. He decided to go rogue. "We're going to get them," Lee said. It was not a request. But Lee had a problem. He did not have enough men. Most of his unit was securing the town. He had his tank, Besotten Jenny, and a handful of infantry. It was not enough to fight through an SS division. He needed backup, and he found it in the most unlikely place imaginable. In the nearby town of Wurgel, a strange resistance had formed. Major Joseph Gangel, a career Wehrmacht officer, had had enough. He had seen the ruin his country had brought upon the world. He had seen the senseless destruction. Gangel had joined forces with the Austrian resistance to protect the local civilians from the SS reprisals. He had a small unit of Wehrmacht soldiers, artillerymen without guns, infantrymen who were tired of the lies. When Captain Lee rolled into town with his Sherman, the locals did not shoot. Gangel walked out to meet him. Picture this scene. It is the stuff of legends. An American captain and a German major meet in the middle of a cobblestone street. Around them, the world is burning. Lee pops the hatch of his Sherman. Gangel salutes. They do not speak the same language, but they speak the language of soldiers. They lay a map on the hull of the tank. Lee points to the castle. "I'm going there." Gangel nods. He knows the castle. He knows the SS are moving toward it. He knows that if the SS take it, it will be a slaughter. And he knows something else. If he helps the American, he is committing high treason. If the SS catch him, he will be hanged from a lamppost with a placard around his neck. But Gangel looks at Lee. He looks at his own men, who are looking to him for moral guidance in a world that has lost its moral compass. "I will come with you," Gangel says, translated by an intermediary. Lee raises an eyebrow. He takes the cigar out of his mouth. "You and whose army, Fritz?" "My men," Gangel replies. "We will fight with you." And just like that, the alliance was forged. An American tank. A truckload of Wehrmacht soldiers in their field grey uniforms, still wearing the eagle on their chests. A handful of American infantry. They formed a convoy. As they drove toward Castle Itter, the absurdity of the situation must have hit them. The Americans were driving past German checkpoints, and the German soldiers in the truck behind them were waving at their countrymen. "It's okay. We with the Yankees." It was surreal. It was madness. But the madness was just beginning. As the convoy wound its way up the steep, winding mountain road toward the castle, the sound of gunfire erupted from the trees. The SS were waiting. The Besotten Jenny roared, its 76mm gun swinging toward the ambush. But before Lee could fire, the German soldiers in the truck behind him opened up. They were firing .42s, Hitler-S buzzsaws, at their own countrymen. The SS, confused by the incoming fire from German weapons, hesitated. That hesitation was all Lee needed. The tank crushed through the roadblock, engine screaming, tracks chewing up the asphalt. They punched through the perimeter and reached the castle gates just as the sun was setting. The heavy iron doors creaked open. The French prime ministers ran out to greet their rescuers. They expected a battalion of Marines. Instead, they got one dirty American tank, 7 American soldiers, and a truckload of the very Germans who had been their jailers until yesterday. Paul Reynaud, the former leader of France, stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at Captain Lee. He looked at Major Gangel. He looked at the SS runes on the collar of a dead soldier in the ditch nearby. "What is this?" Reynaud asked. Captain Lee climbed down from his tank, dusted off his uniform, and grinned. "Mr. Prime Minister," he said, "welcome to the end of the line. But do not get comfortable. The hard part is just starting." Lee was right. They had made it into the castle. But now they were trapped. The 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division knew they were there. They were bringing up 88mm anti-aircraft guns. They were bringing up hundreds of veteran shock troops. And they were angry. Inside the castle, the strangest dinner party in history was taking place. Americans, Wehrmacht soldiers, and French politicians sat around a long wooden table. They checked their weapons. They counted their ammo. It was not much. Outside, in the darkness of the forest, the enemy was moving into position. The silence of the Alps was about to be shattered by a storm of violence. The besotten Jenny was parked at the main gate, blocking the entrance like a steel cork in a bottle. Captain Lee patted the cold armor of his tank. "Old girl," he whispered, "I hope you've got one more fight in you." The sun went down on May 4th. The battle for Castle Itter was about to begin. And nobody, not Lee, not Gangel, not the French, knew if they would live to see the sunrise. Night fell over the Tyrolean Alps like a heavy curtain. Inside the thick stone walls of Castle Itter, the air was thick with tension and cigarette smoke. It was a scene that defied all logic. In the Great Hall, under the gaze of ancient portraits, a council of war was being held. Captain Jack Lee, the brash American from New York, sat at the head of the table. Beside him was Major Joseph Gangel, the weary German officer who had turned against his own flag to do what was right. And around them sat the cream of the French political elite, men who had once commanded armies and run nations, now gripping rifles with white-knuckled hands. The language barrier was a nightmare. Lee spoke English. Gangel spoke German. The French spoke French. Commands had to be translated in a frantic game of telephone. But the universal language of survival needed no translation. Lee took charge. He was a tanker, not an infantryman, but he had the swagger that made men listen. He positioned the besotten Jenny, his trusty Sherman tank, directly in the main archway. It was the only heavy weapon they had. Its 76mm gun pointed down the winding approach road, a steel sentinel daring the SS to come closer. He placed the Wehrmacht soldiers on the ramparts alongside the Americans. Think about that for a second. An American GI, maybe a kid from Ohio, lying prone next to a German Lanzer who might have been shooting at him in Normandy a year ago. Now, they were sharing ammo clips. "Here, buddy. Need bullets?" It was madness. But in war, madness is sometimes the only thing that makes sense. The French VIPs were not content to hide in the cellar. Jean Barotra, the tennis legend, demanded a gun. Even the elderly Paul Reynaud, dressed in his impeccable suit, insisted on taking a post at a window. Lee tried to order them to safety, but these were men of ego and pride. They were not going to be passive victims. The attack did not come immediately. The SS were professionals. They spent the night probing the defenses. A burst of machine gun fire here. A shadow moving there. They were testing the defenders' nerves. They were finding the blind spots. Inside the tank, the crew of the besotten Jenny tried to sleep in their cramped steel seats. They knew that when the sun came up, they would be the primary target. A tank is a magnet for fire. A sitting tank is a coffin. Dawn broke on May 5th with a deceptive beauty. The mist clung to the valley floor, obscuring the horrors hiding within the trees. And then, the silence ended. Crack boom. The first shot did not come from a rifle. It came from an 88mm anti-aircraft gun, the dreaded 88. The SS had dragged it up the mountain during the night. The shell screamed through the air and slammed into the upper floor of the castle, showering the courtyard with stone and glass. The battle was on. From the tree line, hundreds of SS troops poured fire into the castle. Milligram 42 machine guns ripped into the stonework, chipping away the ancient walls. The sound was deafening. The castle, built to withstand medieval sieges of arrows and catapults, was now being hammered by modern high explosives. Captain Lee was everywhere. He was running from window to window, shouting orders, firing his Thompson submachine gun. Keep their heads down. Do not let them get close to the walls. Major Gangle was on the phone. The castle was connected to the local town by a single telephone line that, miraculously, had not been cut yet. He was calling the resistance in Wurgel. We need reinforcements. We are surrounded. There are hundreds of them. But the line went dead mid-sentence. The SS had found the wire. They were alone. And then, disaster struck. The SS gunners zeroed in on the besotten Jenny. The Sherman was a sitting duck in the archway. An 88mm shell slammed into the tank. The explosion rocked the entire castle. Metal shrieked as the armor was pierced. Smoke poured from the hatches. The crew inside bailed out, coughing and choking, scrambling for cover just seconds before the ammunition cooked off. The tank, their only heavy weapon, their symbol of American power, was gone. It was now just a burning wreck blocking the gate. For a moment, panic threatened to take hold. The defenders looked at the burning tank and felt their hope evaporating with the smoke. But Captain Lee did not flinch. He grabbed a young American private by the shoulder. The tank is dead. We are not. Get to the machine gun. The battle turned into a brutal, close-quarters firefight. The SS were inching closer. They were moving up the hill, using the trees and rocks for cover. They had Panzerfausts, deadly anti-tank rockets that could blast a hole in the castle wall. On the ramparts, the Wehrmacht soldiers were fighting with a grim determination. They knew exactly what the SS would do to them if they were captured. They were traitors of the worst kind. There would be no prisoner of war camp for them. There would be a bullet in the back of the neck. They fired their Mausers with the precision of veterans, picking off SS troopers who exposed themselves for a second too long. Inside, the French politicians were proving that they were more than just suits. General Gamelin, the man who had lost France in 1940, was coolly firing a rifle out of a bathroom window. It was a chance for redemption, perhaps. A chance to fight for his country in a way he had not been able to 5 years ago. But the situation was deteriorating. The ammunition was running low. Lee checked his magazines. He was down to his last few. The Wehrmacht soldiers were scavenging rounds from the dead. And then, the inevitable tragedy. Major Gangle saw Paul Reynaud, the former Prime Minister, standing exposed near a wall, trying to get a better shot. The SS machine gunners had spotted him. Bullets were chewing up the stone around him. Gangle did not hesitate. He sprinted across the courtyard. He dove. He pushed Reynaud out of the line of fire. A split second later, a sniper's bullet found its mark. Not Reynaud. Gangle. The German major collapsed onto the cobblestones, blood spreading across his field grey uniform. The man who had switched sides to save lives, the man who had led his troops against his own countrymen to do what was right, lay dying in the arms of the people he had sworn to protect. A silence fell over the courtyard for a heartbeat. The American GI looked at the dying German officer. The French politician looked at the man who had just saved his life. In that moment, the insanity of the war crystallized. A Wehrmacht officer dying for a French prime minister, defended by an American captain. Major! Lee yelled, running over. But it was too late. Gangle was gone. The hero of the resistance was the first casualty of the defense. His death ignited a cold fury in the defenders. They were not just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for revenge. But fury does not manufacture bullets. And they were almost out. It was noon. The sun was high and bright, indifferent to the slaughter. The SS were preparing for the final assault. They knew the tank was dead. They knew the defenders were weakening. You could hear them shouting orders in the woods. Vorwärts.
No merci.
Captain Lee gathered his men. He looked at their tired, soot-stained faces. He looked at the French VIPs. Listen up, he said, his voice raspy. We are down to handguns and knives. When they breach the gate, we retreat to the keep. We make them fight for every stair. We make them fight for every room. Nobody surrenders. Is that clear? Nobody surrenders, the Wehrmacht sergeant nodded. OUI, said the French general. But they needed a miracle. And miracles were in short supply in 1945. Jean Barotra, the tennis star, approached Lee. Captain, he said.
I am fast.
I have legs of iron. I can run through the lines. I can bring help. Lee looked at the walls. The drop was steep. The woods were swarming with SS. You will be killed before you make the trees, Lee said. Perhaps. Barotra smiled, a grim, defiant smile. But if I stay, we all die. Let me try. Lee hesitated. It was a suicide mission, but it was their only card left to play. Go, he said. Run like hell. Barotra vaulted over the wall. He hit the ground running. He was wearing an American uniform jacket to disguise himself. He sprinted through the open ground, bullets kicking up dirt around his heels. He moved with the agility that had won him Wimbledon titles. He zigzagged. He dove. He vanished into the forest. The defenders watched him go, holding their breath. Did he make it? Or was he lying dead in a ditch somewhere? They did not have time to wonder. The SS blew a whistle. The final assault began. A wave of grey uniforms surged out of the trees, firing from the hip. They charged the main gate, scrambling over the burning wreckage of the besotten Jenny. Lee raised his Thompson. He had one magazine left. Here they come. He screamed. Make every shot count. The battle for Castle Itter had reached its climax. The walls were breached. The enemy was at the door. And the only thing standing between the French elite and a massacre was a handful of men who had decided that the enemy of my enemy is my brother. The sound of an empty gun is the loudest sound in the world. Click, click. Captain Jack Lee threw his useless Thompson to the floor. He drew his .45 caliber pistol. Beside him, the French generals were gripping their rifles like clubs. The Wehrmacht soldiers were affixing bayonets. They were in the main keep now, the last line of defense. The heavy oak doors at the bottom of the stairs were booming. Thud, thud. The SS were using a battering ram. It felt like the end of a movie where the heroes do not make it. The kind of ending that leaves the audience silent. Outside, the SS had overrun the courtyard. They were stepping over the body of Major Gangle. They were shouting victory cries. They could taste the blood. They knew who was inside. Daladier, Rhino, the sister of de Gaulle. Prizes that would make them legends in the dying Reich. Or corpses that would satisfy their bloodlust. Inside the keep, the air was suffocating. Dust from the shelling hung in the shafts of sunlight like golden motes. Lee looked at his watch. 3 p.m. hours. 3 p.m. Barotra, the tennis star, had been gone for hours. He was either dead or lost. Gentlemen, Lee said, his voice calm, betraying none of the fear churning in his gut. When that door breaks, we fight with whatever we have. Chairs, knives, fists. We do not let them take us alive. The booming stopped. A silence, heavy and terrible, filled the stairwell. Then, the sound of a heavy latch being blown off with explosives. The doors swung open. A shadow fell across the threshold. A silhouette of a soldier in a helmet. Lee raised his pistol. He took a breath. He began to squeeze the trigger. And then, a sound cut through the noise of the battle. A sound that did not belong. Not the sharp crack of a rifle. Not the boom of an .88. It was a rumble. A deep, guttural growl that vibrated through the stone floor. It grew louder. And louder. Then came the distinctive thwack 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 of a heavy machine gun. Not the rapid rip of a German milligram 42. The slower, rhythmic pounding of an American M2 Browning, .50 caliber.
Madrnče.
Lee lowered his pistol. He ran to the window. Coming up the winding road, smashing through the SS positions like an angry god, was a column of steel. It was not just a relief force. It was the 142nd Infantry Regiment of the 36th Infantry Division. And leading them? A grinning, sweating Jean Barotra, riding on the hood of a jeep, pointing the way. He had made it. He had run through the SS lines, dodged patrols, found the Americans in the valley, and guided them back. The tenor star had served an ace. The arrival of the relief force was chaos incarnate. The SS, focused entirely on the castle, were caught with their pants down. They were hammered from behind. The American half-tracks poured fire into the woods. The SS troops, who moments ago were the hunters, suddenly became the prey. They broke. The fanatics who had sworn to die for the Führer realized that dying today, in a meaningless skirmish over a castle, was a bad deal. They scattered into the forest, disappearing into the alpine shadows. The siege was broken. But the scene that followed was even stranger than the battle. As the American relief troops stormed into the castle courtyard, weapons raised, ready to kill Nazis, they froze. They saw something their brains could not process. They saw American GIs hugging Wehrmacht soldiers. "Do not shoot," Captain Lee yelled, running out of the keep. "They re with us." The liberating soldiers lowered their rifles, confused. They looked at the grey uniforms of the Germans, then at the olive drab of the Americans. They saw the dead body of Major Gangel, covered with a sheet. They saw the French Prime Ministers dusting off their suits. A lieutenant from the relief force walked up to Lee. He looked around the courtyard, at the burning tank, at the pockmarked walls, at the pile of spent brass casings. "Captain," the lieutenant said, "what the hell is going on here?"
Lili a cigar.
His hands were shaking, just a little. "You would not believe me if I told you, Lieutenant," he said. "Let's just say we had some local help. The prisoners were free. The battle was over." But the reality of what had happened began to set in. They gathered around the body of Major Joseph Gangel. The Wehrmacht soldiers, his men, stood at attention. Some were crying. They had fought against their own people to save the lives of their enemies. They had committed the ultimate act of treason in the eyes of their government, and the ultimate act of heroism in the eyes of humanity. The French VIPs, men who had spent their lives in the cutthroat world of politics, were silent. They had been saved not by armies or treaties, but by the courage of a few men who decided to ignore the uniforms they wore. As the adrenaline faded, the exhaustion took over. Lee sat on the running board of a truck. He was covered in soot, grease, and blood. He took a long drag of his cigar and looked at the Alps. The war was effectively over for him. He had survived the last battle. But for the Wehrmacht soldiers who had fought beside him, the future was uncertain. They were now prisoners of war. They were stripped of their weapons. They were loaded into trucks. One of the German soldiers looked at Lee as he was being led away. He did not say anything. He just nodded. A small, almost imperceptible nod of respect. Lee nodded back. Two soldiers, enemies by decree, brothers by circumstance, acknowledging the bond that only combat can forge. The French were whisked away to Paris, to be celebrated as heroes of the resistance, even though they had spent most of the war in prison. They would go on to write memoirs, to give speeches, to rebuild France. But what about the rest? What about the story? It was buried. Why? Because it did not fit the narrative. The US Army did not want to publicize a battle where they fought alongside Nazis. It was confusing. It was politically awkward. Americans and Germans fighting SS? Too complicated for the newsreels. So, the files were stamped classified or just filed away in the bottom of a dusty cabinet in the Pentagon. Captain Jack Lee did not get a parade. He did not get a movie deal. He got a Distinguished Service Cross, sure, but the details were vague. He went home to New York, became a bartender, and rarely spoke about the castle. He died in 1973, taking the full story to his grave. Major Gangel was buried in Wurgel. For years, he was just another German officer who died in the war. A name on a stone. It took decades for the truth to come out. It took historians digging through the archives, finding the combat reports, piecing together the impossible timeline. Today, in Austria, Joseph Gangl is a hero. There is a street named after him in Wörgl. He is remembered as the man who chose humanity over ideology. But the story of Castle Itter is more than just a quirky footnote. It is a mirror. It forces us to look at war not as a clash of faceless armies, but as a series of individual choices. On that day, May 5, 1945, the lines on the map did not matter. The flags did not matter. What mattered was a choice. A choice to stand up against evil, even if it meant standing with your enemy. Think about that. Think about the trust it took for Lee to turn his back on armed German soldiers. Think about the courage it took for Gangl to order his men to shoot at the SS. It is the only time in history that the Star-Spangled Banner and the Wehrmacht Eagle flew over the same fortress, defending the same people. And as the sun set on Castle Itter that evening, the smoke from the besotten Jenny still rising into the cool mountain air, the world was a slightly different place. The war had ended not with a final act of hatred, but with a strange, beautiful act of cooperation. But wait. Before we close the book on this, there is one final twist. A detail that makes you question everything you think you know about enemies. Because among the defenders, there was one man I have not mentioned yet. A man whose presence there is the ultimate irony. An SS officer. Yes, you heard me right. Not all the SS were outside the walls. One was inside, fighting with the Americans. Let us talk about Hauptsturmführer Kurt Siegfried Traitor. You thought the story could not get any weirder? You thought Americans and Wehrmacht fighting together was the peak of insanity? Meet Kurt Siegfried Traitor. Traitor was not a conscript. He was not a regular soldier. He was a Hauptsturmführer in the Waffen-SS, an elite officer, a man sworn to the death cult of the Third Reich. By all accounts, he should have been leading the charge against the castle, not defending it. But Traitor was a pragmatist. He was recovering from wounds in a nearby hospital when the chaos started. He knew the war was lost. He knew the fanatics of the 17th Division were on a suicide mission. And he knew something else. If he wanted to survive the next 24 hours, he needed to make friends with the winners. So, incredibly, he drove to the castle before the siege began. He offered his services to Captain Lee. Imagine the scene. Captain Lee, the cigar-chomping American, looking at a man in the black-collared uniform of the SS, the enemy of enemies, the embodiment of everything the Allies were fighting to destroy. Lee did not shoot him. He handed him a gun. Why? Because Traitor brought something the defenders desperately needed: knowledge. He knew the tactics of the attacking SS division. He knew how they thought. He knew where they would place their machine guns. During the battle, while the besotten Jenny was burning and the walls were crumbling, Traitor was directing fire. He was pointing out targets to the Americans and the Wehrmacht soldiers. Watch the tree line there. They will try to flank us there. And he was right. Every time. Traitor fought bravely. He did not run. He stood his ground alongside the French politicians he had helped imprison, and the American soldiers who would likely arrest him the next day. When the battle ended, Traitor was arrested, of course. He was held as a prisoner of war. But here is the kicker. The French VIPs, the very people the SS had terrorized for years, testified on his behalf. They wrote letters saying, "This man saved our lives." Because of their testimony, Traitor was released in 1947. He lived a quiet life in Germany until the 1990s. The battle for Castle Itter is not just a quirky anecdote. It is a Rorschach test for human nature. It strips away the uniforms and the flags and asks a brutal question. When the world is ending, who are you? Are you Sebastian Wimmer, the coward commander who fled on a bicycle to save his own skin? Are you the fanatics in the woods, killing for a dead cause because hate is the only thing you have left? Or are you Joseph Gangl and Jack Lee, men who realize that enemy is a temporary label, but human is permanent? The legacy of this battle is profound, even if it is forgotten by the masses. For the US Army, it is a lesson in adaptability. Captain Lee did not follow the manual. The manual says, "Kill Germans." Lee rewrote the manual. He saw an asset, and he used it. That kind of independent thinking is what wins wars. For the Germans, it is a complex memory. Gangel is a hero, yes, but he represents the path not taken. How many lives could have been saved if more officers had done what he did? If they had turned their guns on the fanatic sooner? It is a haunting what if that hangs over post-war Germany. And for us, the viewers, it is a reminder that history is never clean. It is messy. It is contradictory. We like to think of World War II as the good war, where the lines were clear. But at Castle Itter, the lines were drawn in smoke and blood, and they crossed in ways that defy belief. The castle stands there today. It is private property now, not a museum. You see not go inside. It sits on its hill, silent and imposing, guarding its secrets. The pockmarks from the bullets have been patched over. The burnt hull of the besotten Jenny was dragged away and scrapped long ago. But if you stand in the valley of Brixental, and you look up at those towers, you can almost feel it. You can feel the ghost of that strange, impossible day. The day the world turned upside down. So, the next time someone tells you that enemies can never be friends, or that the world is black and white, tell them about the battle for Castle Itter. Tell them about the day the American tank and the German soldier stood back to back. Because sometimes, the most unbelievable stories are the only ones that are true. This has been your channel name. We dig up the history they tried to bury. If you made it this far, you re the kind of person who appreciates the deep cuts of history. I want to hear from you. In the comments, answer this. If you were Captain Lee, would you have trusted the SS officer Traitor? Or would you have locked him up? Let the debate begin. And do not forget to like and subscribe. We have more stories coming. Stories of lost nukes, secret armies, and the forgotten heroes of the wars you thought you knew.